Welcome to Literary Analysis Essay Outlining with Mrs. T. This video assumes you already have some brainstorming work done and know where you are going with your paper. If you need help with brainstorming, please see my other video about that topic. Today we will go over a few types of literary analysis outlines and I'll share some examples with you. Feel free to pause and fast forward as needed. Before we get going on your outline, you need to make sure you know what you're going to prove, and that requires you to have a thesis. If you don't already have one, just follow these simple steps. If you do, go ahead and skip past this. So, your thesis statement should answer a couple of questions related to the text you've been asked to analyze. The first question is answering some simple questions. What is the author's message about blank topic? So you have to figure out what's a topic or idea that keeps popping up in it that you think is important. Or ask yourself, what are they arguing about that topic through their writing? Answering that in a complete sentence can give you a really good start toward a thesis statement. The other question you need to consider is what writing techniques help support this message or argument. Now, finally, try to combine these into one answer. The statement should be general, universal, and broad. In other words, I can apply it to the world around me and not just to the book itself. It really shouldn't bring up examples from the text, but it's something that you are going to prove throughout your paper. And I often tell my students to include a because or multiple factors involved with that opinionated statement. So let's look at my example. It says, through his inclusion of derogatory words, body language, and symbolism, Steinbeck critiques how men use violence to control women and keep them in one of two expected submissive roles, as women who are silent and obedient objects, or immoral and untrusted objects, both roles which make the women easily replaceable and used for the man's benefit. See how that's a complex idea, but it's universal. I can apply it to our world. I also note that Steinbeck is critiquing this concept. It's not saying he just says it or supports it, but he's criticizing this idea through his work. So for the literary analysis essay, there's lots of ways you can organize your body paragraphs and the main argument. You want to have a good line of reasoning, though. In other words, you want things to be thought through and connect from one point to the next. So these are 4 types that I suggest to my students as they're working through, and I will give you more details on this in the rest of the video. The first one is chronological. That is to show how an idea develops over the course of the text. The biggest warning with that one is to make sure you don't end up with a book summary. The next one is character-based, that you divide your ideas by characters which help demonstrate your theme idea. Third one is subtopics. You actually take the big idea and you break it down into lots of smaller topics or categories that then you can pick apart with examples and writing techniques from the book. Fourth one is literary devices and choices. This is if you notice the same technique throughout the text. It can work really well that you do a paragraph about each of these really strong writing techniques that the author includes to help support their main idea or their theme. And finally, there is a fifth one, cause and effect. It's just not as common. Sometimes your main idea may be closely tied to how one thing causes another, and that could work really well for your essay. You can also, bonus points, do a combo. Maybe you like to do a chronological order, but with also based on characters. So you're going to focus on certain characters in certain parts of the work. Just be careful with that. That can be a little complex and messy. Whatever you pick, you need to remember that you need to analyze the writing choices throughout your argument. So even if you don't pick the literary device or choice organization, in the other ones, you still need to embed that throughout your essay. All right, if you pick chronological organization, you are really looking at how a theme develops throughout the text. The biggest thing to be careful with this organizational structure is it can quickly turn into a summary of a text. So you want to make sure you are really clear in making sure you're focused on the way the piece is written and what each section is adding to the theme and helping to develop it. So this means you're going to talk about the beginning in the first body paragraph and then have body paragraphs which demonstrate how the story or poem or the next stanza, the next act of the play, whatever it is that comes next, however you chunked out the text, you're going to see how it added to, complicated, developed, or changed the theme. Note that chronological can also be something you use within your body paragraphs, even if you don't pick this for your overall structure. So if you pick one of the other structures, you might want to also think about when you introduce evidence, taking it chronologically through the text to show how this idea is brought up early, then partway through, and then at the end. And then hopefully have an example for each one. If you need to, you can pause and check out my example in the black box. I have this for a 5-body paragraph essay, which actually would turn out being a 7-paragraph essay. It includes not only what that paragraph is going to be about, but what writing techniques I would include. Note, this isn't really an outline. I mean, it kind of is. I consider it a little bit more of a pre-writing because it has very general ideas that I'm going to use in my essay. For character-based organization, you have to have a theme that is demonstrated through multiple characters, obviously. So you are going to prove your theme by arguing how these different characters demonstrate it. Each paragraph tends to focus on a different character. I have some students do compare and contrast in those between maybe a couple of characters. It just depends on the text that you're analyzing. Obviously, this one's probably not going to work for most poetry. Poetry tends to not have a lot of characters. It just depends on what you pick. So if you need to pause, you can look at my example in the black text. This one comes from Of Mice and Men, like the others throughout this PowerPoint. Let's say you have a big idea for your theme statement and it's a huge category. So for example, if I have one about gender norms, which is the one I've been working with, gender norms and roles, I may want to analyze different components of that or different types of gender roles. If you go back to my brainstorming video, at the end of it, it has where I brainstormed this idea a little bit, and you can see how I start to break down the main topic into these examples of different types of gender norms that are reinforced in the book and that the author is criticizing those. So you just need to know, will your topic really work with breaking it down into smaller ideas? Let's say you notice a lot of writing techniques the author used in order to prove the theme, like you noticed them being used frequently throughout the book. So for example, symbolism, word choice, patterns, foreshadowing, simile, metaphor, personification, what have you. You could prove your theme by explaining how the way the author wrote the book gave you insight into the theme and helped develop it. The big thing to be careful with this one is make sure you are really clear on what the technique is and then how it relates back. Also, you need to have them interrelate. So you have a line of reasoning, which I'll talk more about later, but you need to make sure that you can connect these ideas. So for example, in mine, I have all this symbolism that I analyzed, and then I had a body paragraph that talks about how those help foreshadow, which foreshadow is a technique as well. So I'm going to have a paragraph about the symbolism of the color red, which is associated with Curly's wife. And the red is used for a couple of things. One is the sexuality side of her personality, and the other one is it's tied to death because of blood and violence. But then my next paragraph is about mice and what they symbolize. So how do I connect those together? How do I relate the mice to red? How do I transition between these? Is this just another symbolic idea that relates to tragedy? That could be the thing that combines all of those, which then would lead us to the foreshadowing aspect of the argument. Cause and effect organization is a little more complex to understand for a literary analysis, but if your topic deals with a lot of character choices and behaviors which affect others or themselves or the plot or the conflicts, you could do a cause and effect structure. So my example is, again, still about gender roles and norms. I'm keeping that the same throughout for the book Of Mice and Men. This one has 6 body paragraphs, so it'd actually be an 8-paragraph essay, because I decided to split the cause and effect between paragraphs. Decided I'd have, let's say, body paragraph 1 be about the cause of women being controlled, which is men being seen as aggressive and competitive creatures. So that's the expectation, and so that leads to women being controlled. And then I have all these characters I know that I'm going to include in that, and my writing choices are going to be description and dialogue. And then the next paragraph is the effect. The effect that the women being controlled has is that the men fear each other and also fear Curly's wife because of this competition, aggression, and the controlling. It all leads to that. So that's how you could do this. I could easily have kept those in paragraphs together, like have the cause and effect in the same paragraph. That would be totally okay. It's just I felt like that would start to be a really long paragraph, so I split them into 6. But this could easily have been a 3-body paragraph essay. All right, so that was all about the main types of organizational structures for literary analysis that I suggest to my students to help them have a line of reasoning. So now it's time to actually organize and collect evidence and create your actual outline. You can use a pre-made outline. You can create your own. There's many online, and I have examples in here. I will try to link up to some of those in the description as well. Now that you know which organizational structure works for what you are doing, it's time to start doing the actual outlining work. Hopefully you've already done some brainstorming and pre-writing steps to work through your ideas and what examples you want to use. If not, go see my video on brainstorming the literary analysis essay. The key for an outline is to create a resource which works for you. The biggest error I see on essays is a lack of structure and organization, which results in a disjointed paper without a line of reasoning. This often results in low-scoring writing because the paper simply does not make much sense and everything feels thrown together. Part of a literary analysis is to show you know how to think complexly and can make connections between ideas by analyzing a text. I find some students naturally think through ideas in a logical manner, while others do not. I also know there are some students who think, oh, I'll just reorganize my paragraphs as I write or after I'm done writing. But many of these students would benefit from organizing beforehand so they don't waste time writing something they may end up needing to delete, or they feel compelled to make it fit, and then it just feels out of place. This is why outlining is such a valuable tool, but you need to do it right and take the proper steps. So, on the one end of the spectrum, we have those who like to have incredibly detailed outlines with every single quotation written out, interpretations jotted down, and topic sentences fully written. If that's helpful for you, do it. Many of the kids who do it this way simply have to go take all the things they've written, put them together in paragraphs, and then work on revising for some flow. At the other end of the spectrum are those who just need to know what each paragraph will be about and what evidence they will use. This is usually just some quick paraphrasing, and the student plans to go find the specifics later. And then there's everything in between. Finally, remember to follow your teacher's requirements and expectations. Sometimes I have a lot of struggling writers, so I have the whole class do a detailed outline because the majority need that organizational strategy. It's not always the best, and the kids who know how to organize ideas sometimes are frustrated, but again, sometimes the teacher likes an outline so they know what you're going to do when you start to write, and they want to fix your problems before they get too big. Before we go into how to outline, let's look a little bit at why we do this. On your screen, you see an example outline. Feel free to click pause and write this down if you want. It can be a good start for an actual outline for your paper. Now, the reason an outline can be helpful is to make sure all your ideas connect back to proving your thesis and that your argument builds on top of previous portions. It's very easy to have each body paragraph be related to the thesis, but what about the relationship between body paragraphs? So, in other words, if we look at this is what I'm proving is my thesis. Body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2 need to both point directly back to the thesis. Your concrete details need to be related to this. Your commentary needs to explain how that happens. In other words, your commentary connects the example up to this. Okay? And then what we also need is a connection between, I'll do a different color here so you can see this. We need a connection between the evidence itself. So we kind of have to do a few things at the same time in order to have a line of reasoning. There's connections between paragraphs, but also within paragraphs. So the other thing we need to also consider is how body paragraph 2 adds to what body paragraph 1 had to say. That's probably one of the biggest line of reasoning suggestions I have, and how an outline can help you make sure you have that. So some things to consider with that is think about how does your second body paragraph add to, support, progress, build, or further develop the previous paragraph. When you get to the third paragraph, you do the same thing by asking how this adds to the previous paragraphs. That could be paragraph 1 or 2. And you can refer back to those to make that connection clear. And again, don't forget, you want to put all your information within paragraphs in a logical order that makes sense, so you can comment on how your second example adds to what was in your first example. So again, you need to make these connections between ideas and not just have them stand alone. That will give you a really nice flow and, again, the logical connection. So as you develop your outline, think about the order of your elements and how they relate to each other. This is why the orders given at the beginning of this video are also helpful. They give you the start at a logical structure when done correctly, and you just have to fill in the gaps appropriately. The alphanumeric outline is one of the most used outlines ever. It looks just like the outline I had on the previous section on line of reasoning. You can see it here on your screen for at least 2 body paragraphs, and they would continue in the same manner. Also, the amount of evidence you have is going to be different depending on the paragraphs. I just simply went with 3 to give you a good chunk. For this one, you have layers of identification, and some of you may have taken notes in a class like this. My AP biology teacher did this a lot, and this is really how I learned this method. So you go in a hierarchy of letters and numbers, and you start with, I call it kind of the most capital. So like, is there a capital number 1? No. So we use Roman numerals for that. So it's technically an I there, just my font, it's hard to see. And then if I happen to have more than one thesis for some reason, I guess it'd be Roman numeral 2. But for this purpose, we'd only use it once, and it would be the capital I for Roman numeral 1. All right, then next up, you're going to notice we have our next layer of organization, which is our paragraphs. So those are represented by capital letters to help them stand out. And you're going to notice there's also slight indentation on each of these parts. And that's what also visually helps separate the information for your use. All right, the next layer is your evidence layer. So those are with just regular numbers out here. Okay, and I can easily find them because of this structure. The lowercase letters are for what goes into the evidence itself. So breaking that down a little bit more. So I have the little A's and B's all the way through here. Okay. And then finally, we have what makes up the commentary. There's 2 different things commentary can do. One is interpretation, one is explanation of how it proves your subclaim. So here's that. There are other things like connection between evidence and all that, but for a basic outline, this gives you a good start. So I just want to show you how those layers work, how there's slight indentation for each of those parts so they line up really nicely. And that's why this one is so widely used. What I call the full sentence outline, I also call it the chunk style writing. This is just like the alphanumeric, but instead you write out full sentences from each component. So you're really kind of, instead of worrying about the labeling so much, you're worried more about writing full ideas. Because on the previous outline, you could either do that with full sentences or with like phrases, that type of thing. But for this one, it's just like the next step on it where you actually fill it in with complete sentences. So you're kind of writing a first full draft, but in these chunks. And again, that's why I call it the chunk style outline with my students, because you kind of write these chunks of the essay and then you put them into paragraphs later. Again, if you do that method, you're going to have to smooth out your writing because it is going to read very chunky. But for kids that really struggle with writing, this can be really helpful because it kind of forces you to write your first draft and they're labeled what each one is. So it gives you that focus as you're writing. Some kids like to just do a bullet point outline. This is similar to an alphanumeric, but indentation and bullet points are incredibly important to create visual separation between parts of the essay. So again, it goes in the order that is typical. It's just instead of using the Roman numeral and letter system and numbers, it's just using bullet points. So again, just another option out there for you to brainstorm. All right, so here's what I'm going to show you as a creative outline. I call it that because there's lots of things that can fall into this category. And one of those is like students who create boxes of information, or they draw arrows, or they use a bullet point outline and color code the chunks. So for this one, I started doing some color coding with my highlighter. And so my body paragraph 1 is that, and then I do a different color for body paragraph 2 to really separate that out. And then I might have students go, okay, evidence 2 is going to add to, so in yellow they put that, sorry if it's hard to see, I'll go orange just to make it easier to see. Okay, so maybe I know this one adds to that one, and then maybe this one is like new, so maybe I'm even going to put that it's new, so the line of reasoning, because maybe this is a different writing technique down here for evidence 3 that's being used, so maybe this is different a writing technique, and I make note of what that is. Now, of course, all these words are going to be replaced with the actual ideas, the actual examples, the actual commentary. You can keep the labels if you want, but some students can just look at an outline structure and just write up these things. And they just need that reminder of what the order is. Remember, if you've done a SIR paragraph in a class, this is the same concept. So you have claim, evidence, reasoning. And I go over this in my body paragraphs video as well. But that's really what this whole context is doing with the example is your evidence here, and the commentary section is your reasoning. And then the claim is really your body paragraph, or sorry, your topic sentence for your body paragraph, your subclaim. There's lots of different terms you can use for it. So on a creative outline, there's lots of kids that do it differently. Some will actually use boxes, so they'll like put evidence 1 in a box with all of its information, and then put evidence 2 in its own box, and they draw the boxes as they're working, not after the fact. So they would do a little box and use that to keep their ideas organized and separated, and so they can come back later to do it. Visual mapping, there's some definite pros and cons to visual mapping. Some teachers don't like this kind of outline because sometimes they're hard for an outside eye to really understand what you're going for because they can get really complex, or they may appear really disorganized on first glance and really hard to interpret. My other issue with this type is that sometimes they lack specificity or organization. It's like kids just jotted stuff down and they're like, I'm going to figure it out later. And so it's really not working as an organizational strategy unless there's some thought put into it. So I'll demonstrate really quickly how this might work. So first I might have my thesis about, and you can do this in the middle of your paper, like in the center, or you can do it at the top and then branch out from there. It depends if you like to be a center and branch out in a web, or if you like to do maybe kind of more like a tree of ideas coming down from the top, kind of like the roots of a tree. So I will do the one in the middle first. So that is, I would have maybe, a circle or a box with my thesis written in it. And let's say I'm doing the one about gender norms. So I would have what is the idea about gender norms that Steinbeck is going for in his book right there. Okay. Then I may know which directions I want to go in. So I'm going to put those connected boxes, like maybe I'm going to have this side is all about the expectations placed on women. And this one's going to be about men. Okay, and then I'm going to branch out from there with I'm going to go here. I'm going to be like, oh, women at home. They're supposed to be at home. And then I'm going to go with another one that this book is talking about, which is like they can't be friends with men or can't talk to men unless it's their husband. And then maybe another one of like they can't have their own dreams. So this is very much based off subtopics. Okay. And then for the men, I do the same thing. I have some branching out ideas of what are the expectations placed on men in the book, okay? And then you've probably seen things like this before. You start to branch out from there, like, oh, here's my example. So I'm just going to label these just what they are. And maybe I notice, like, okay, what's the writing technique going on? Oh, maybe these have the same writing technique. So I'm going to put WT for writing technique. Whereas these ones, maybe they're completely different ones that I notice that they are. Okay. Now these things here, instead of being subtopics, I could have done it by writing technique. So whichever of the paragraphing structures you think you're going to go with, that should be the first things that branch out from the thesis. So this one happens to be subtopics. So again, we branch out and we keep going and we keep webbing out and out and out and out. And then we can start to go back in and do cool things like making connections, like going, okay, which one do I want to talk about first? Oh, well, I want to go with the, you have to stay at home thing. Okay, that's my first one. So I put a number 1 there. And then I think that relates really well to the can't talk with men, because again, this has to do with like maybe loneliness. So maybe I even make a note that this is why these women, the woman in the book is lonely. And then this is why she can't pursue her own dreams. That ties into it. That if you can't even get out of the house and you can't talk to anybody else without negative consequences, then your own dreams are dead, which is kind of the point we're making there. So that's going to be my number 3. Okay, so this is how we can start to build a structure. And even if we don't know what order we're going to go in, this can work really well, because then you can go in later and put a number for what order you want to write about each one. And the same thing with the side about the men. And then I got to decide, which one do I want to talk about first overall? Do I want to talk about men and the expectations placed on them, and then talk about the women? And maybe I want to do that, because maybe this is like, I feel like I put an A so I don't confuse it with my other letters, and B. Maybe I feel like the men's issues are the reason why the women are treated this way. Maybe those are the underpinnings. Or maybe I want to swap it. Maybe I don't like that. Maybe I think this one would logically work first to talk about, and talk about what's placed on women. Okay, so that's how a visual map works, is you just kind of make these connections, and then you can go back in and you can start to label and work with them. And you see how messy it is, and this is why some teachers may not like it as an outlining strategy. They may see it more as just a pre-writing brainstorming strategy, but I've seen some kids do really good work with this type, that it really is an outline because of the details they put in. So if that works for you, try it out. All right, thank you for joining me on this video about outlining for the literary analysis essay. If you would like to support my work or see more of my materials, please visit my YouTube channel. You can like or subscribe there, or visit my Teachers Pay Teachers page, where you can buy some of my materials that I've curated. Thanks and good luck.